I still look at the framed photographs from the first 2 days in Positano and wonder how a person can look so radiantly happy while carrying the seeds of their own destruction right beneath the surface. My name is Elena. I am 32, and 3 months ago I married Daniel, a man who is the absolute definition of a safe harbor. Daniel is a structural engineer, a man who looks at the world through the lens of stability, load-bearing capacities, and carefully calculated margins of safety. And that is exactly why I chose him. He loved me with a quiet, unshakable devotion that made me feel protected after years of drifting through chaotic, open-ended relationships that always seemed to leave me bruised. Our honeymoon was supposed to be the coronation of this new, stable life we were building together, a 2-week escape to the Amalfi Coast, where the pastel-colored houses clung to the cliffs above a sea so blue it looked painted. We checked into a luxury hotel tucked away in the cliffs, a place with terracotta tiles, white bougainvillea draping over the private balcony, and a view that took your breath away every time you opened the shutters. Daniel was in his element, holding my hand as we walked down the narrow, winding stone stairs to the beach, pointing out the architecture of the old watchtowers, his voice steady and calm. But even in those first 48 hours, surrounded by the scent of lemon trees and salt water, I felt a familiar, quiet restlessness creeping back into my chest. I had spent so long running on the high-octane drama of unstable love that the peace Daniel offered me began to feel like a slow deceleration, a gentle flattening of my emotional landscape that made me feel slightly numb. I told myself it was just the transition, the natural come-down from the stress of planning a wedding. But deep down, I was already looking for a spark to jumpstart my system, completely blind to the fact that the fire I was looking for would burn my entire life to the ground. The encounter happened on our third afternoon, a day when the heat was so thick it felt like a physical weight pressing down on the cobbled streets of the town square. Daniel had wanted to stay by the hotel pool to read, but I felt too twitchy to sit still. So I told him I was going to walk down to the marina to buy some local linen shirts and grab an iced espresso. I was sitting at a small, round metal table under the yellow awning of a cliffside cafe, watching the tourists navigate the steep stairs, when I heard a voice that made my breath catch in my throat. It was a low, slightly raspy laugh, a sound that carried a specific, familiar cadence I had spent 3 years trying to forget. I turned my head slowly, my fingers freezing on the glass of my drink, and saw Leo standing at the counter, just a few feet away, paying for a bottle of water. Leo was the ghost that had haunted my entire 20s, the man who had loved me with a passionate, volatile intensity that had repeatedly broken us both apart until we finally walked away because we were destroying each other. He looked exactly the same, perhaps a little more suntanned, his dark curls slightly wild from the sea breeze, wearing a crumpled linen shirt that looked like he had slept in it. As if sensing my gaze, he turned around, his eyes locking onto mine, and the shock that registered on his face was immediately replaced by that slow, familiar smile that had always made me forget every boundary I had ever set. He walked over to my table, his stride easy and confident, and before I could even think about Daniel or my wedding ring or the fact that I was on my honeymoon, he was pulling out the chair opposite me and sitting down as if no time had passed at all. "Elena," he said, his voice carrying that old, intimate warmth that made my chest tighten with a mixture of excitement and terror. "Of all the places in the world, what are the chances of finding you here?" I sat there like an idiot, my heart hammering against my ribs, trying to find my voice, while my mind raced with the sheer impossibility of the moment. I told him I was here on my honeymoon, pointing to the simple gold band on my left hand, expecting him to back away or offer some polite, distant congratulations. But Leo just looked at the ring, then up at my face, his eyes studying me with an intensity that made me feel completely exposed. "Married," he murmured, his smile turning slightly sad, though he didn't move away. "I always thought you'd do it, but seeing it is different. Is he good to you?" The question was too intimate, too direct for a conversation between ex-lovers who hadn't spoken in 2 years. But that was always Leo's style. He bypassed the small talk and went straight for the bruises. Instead of telling him it was none of his business, I found myself nodding, defending Daniel, telling him that my husband was the best man I had ever met. We sat there for an hour, the conversation flowing with an ease that terrified me, catching up on mutual friends and life changes. But beneath the casual words, the old, dangerous chemistry was humming like a live wire. When I finally stood up to leave, realizing Daniel would be wondering where I was, Leo reached out and wrote his phone number on a paper napkin, sliding it across the table toward me. "For old time's sake," he said, his eyes holding mine. "I'm staying at a place down by the harbor for the week. Let me know if you want to grab a drink, just to catch up properly." I took the napkin, stuffing it into my pocket as I walked away, telling myself I would throw it in the trash the second I got back to the hotel, but knowing even then that I was lying to myself. When I got back to the hotel room, Daniel was waiting for me, his face lighting up with that sweet, uncomplicated smile that usually made me feel safe, but now just made me feel a hot flush of guilt. He had laid out a beautiful silk dress I had bought for our dinner that night, and he had booked a reservation at a Michelin-starred restaurant built into a cave overlooking the sea. "You were gone a long time, sweetheart," he said, wrapping his arms around my waist from behind and kissing the side of my neck. "Did you find what you were looking for?" I forced a laugh, my voice sounding tight in my own ears as I told him the shops were crowded and I'd gotten distracted by the views. I went into the bathroom to shower, my mind spinning, and as I took off my shorts, the paper napkin fell out of my pocket onto the tiled floor. I stared at the messy blue ink of Leo's handwriting, my hand trembling as I picked it up and hid it inside my makeup bag instead of throwing it in the toilet. During dinner, I was a ghost at our own table. Daniel was talking about the menu, about the boat tour he had booked for us the next day, and about how he wanted to buy a house in the suburbs when we got back. I nodded and smiled in all the right places, but all I could hear was Leo's voice asking if he was good to me, and all I could see was the contrast between Daniel's neat, structured life and the wild, unpredictable current that Leo represented. I realized with a sink of dread that I was already mentally checking out of my marriage, less than a week after saying my vows. My old addiction to chaos pulling me toward the edge of a cliff I had no business standing on. The next morning, Daniel woke up with a mild headache from the red wine we had drunk the night before, and he suggested we push the boat tour to the afternoon so he could rest in the room for a few hours. This was the opening I had been secretly waiting for, the opportunity to step out of the married life I had constructed and test the waters of my past. I told him to sleep, kissing his forehead before slipping out of the room in my sundress, my phone already in my hand as I walked down the quiet hotel corridor. I pulled the napkin out of my bag, my heart beating in a frantic, irregular rhythm as I typed Leo's number into my phone and sent a short text. "I have a couple of hours. Meet me at the cafe by the marina?" The reply was almost instantaneous, a simple, "See you there in 10." I walked down the steep stone stairs to the harbor, the morning air fresh and cool, but my skin felt hot and itchy with anticipation. When I arrived, Leo was already sitting at a table near the water, 2 cups of espresso already waiting, and the sight of him sitting there in the morning light made me feel a dangerous rush of adrenaline. I sat down, telling myself this was just closure, just two old friends having a civilized conversation. But the way he looked at me, his eyes taking in my bare shoulders and the way the breeze moved my hair, told me we were playing a game with no safety net. "You came," he said softly, reaching across the table to touch the tips of my fingers. And instead of pulling my hand away, I let it stay, the warmth of his skin sending a shockwave straight to my chest. We spent the next 2 hours walking along the rocky coastline, away from the crowded beaches and the main tourist paths, finding a secluded rocky cove where the waves crashed gently against the stones. We sat on the rocks, our knees touching, talking about the way our relationship had ended, the bitter arguments and the tearful goodbyes that had left us both scarred. Leo was apologetic, admitting he had been reckless and selfish during our time together. But he also reminded me of the good times, the raw, unfiltered passion that we had never been able to find with anyone else. "I've tried to move on, Elena. I really have," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper as he leaned closer, his breath warm against my cheek. "But every woman I've been with since you has just felt like a compromise, a safe, boring compromise." The word boring hit me like a physical blow, echoing the exact thoughts I had been having about my life with Daniel, and I felt my defenses crumbling under the weight of his words. He reached out, his hand cupping my jaw, his thumb brushing over my lower lip. And instead of thinking about Daniel waiting for me in the hotel room, I leaned into his touch. When he kissed me, it wasn't the sweet, respectful kiss that Daniel gave me. It was a desperate, hungry reclamation that swept away every shred of my resolve, and I kissed him back with a ferocity that shocked me. We moved closer to the shadow of the cliff wall, the world outside disappearing as we crossed the line, the heat of the Italian sun and the sound of the sea drowning out the quiet, steady life I had promised to build. The walk back to the hotel was a blur of panic and a strange, illicit high that made my skin prickle with guilt and excitement. I kept checking my reflection in the shop windows, terrified that the betrayal was written on my face, that Daniel would look at me and instantly know that another man's touch was still lingering on my skin. When I walked into the suite, Daniel was out of bed, fully dressed, packing a small backpack for our rescheduled boat tour, his headache apparently gone. "There you are," he said, turning around with a smile that made my stomach drop into a bottomless pit of shame. "I was starting to think you'd gotten lost again. You smell like sunscreen and salt." I forced a smile, my hands trembling as I walked past him to the bathroom, claiming I had been exploring the rocky paths down by the cliffs and had gotten splashed by the waves. I looked in the mirror, seeing my flushed cheeks and my slightly swollen lips, and felt a sudden suffocating wave of self-loathing. I washed my face with cold water, trying to scrub away the feel of Leo's kisses. But the memory was printed onto my skin, a permanent brand of my infidelity. Throughout the boat tour, as we glided past the towering cliffs and the hidden grottos of the coast, Daniel kept his arm wrapped around me, pointing out the sights and kissing my cheek, completely unaware that he was holding a stranger. I sat beside him, the cold realization settling in that I had just ruined the most honest relationship I had ever had, and that the man next to me was loving a version of me that no longer existed. The tension in the room that evening was thick, a silent current that Daniel seemed to sense, even if he couldn't put a name to it. He was quiet during dinner, his eyes resting on me with a questioning, watchful look that made me want to run out of the restaurant and never come back. I had my phone hidden under my thigh on the chair, my fingers occasionally slipping down to check for messages from Leo, my heart stopping every time the screen lit up with a preview. Leo had texted me twice. "I can't stop thinking about you. Meet me tonight at the harbor bar after he goes to sleep." The temptation was a physical ache, a dark pull that made my chest feel tight. And instead of deleting the texts, I left them there, a ticking time bomb in my pocket. When we got back to the room, Daniel didn't initiate sex. He just lay on his side of the bed, staring at the ceiling, his voice quiet when he finally spoke. "You've been somewhere else today, Elena," he said, not looking at me. "Since yesterday, actually. It's like you're here physically, but you're not really with me. Is something wrong? Are you regretting us?" The vulnerability in his voice made me feel like a monster, but instead of telling the truth, I doubled down on the lie, telling him he was being paranoid, that I was just tired from the travel and the heat. He didn't argue. He just nodded slowly and turned his back to me, the distance between us on the mattress feeling like an ocean. I waited until I heard the slow, deep rhythm of Daniel's breathing that indicated he was finally asleep before I slipped out of bed, my heart throat high as I grabbed my phone and a light sweater. I didn't think about the consequences. I didn't think about the vows I had made just days before, and I didn't think about the man sleeping peacefully just a few feet away. I only thought about the heat of Leo's touch and the escape he offered from the reality of my choices. I crept out of the suite, the quiet corridor of the hotel feeling like a tunnel to another life, and walked down the steep, dark stairs to the harbor bar. Leo was there, sitting in a dim corner with a bottle of wine, and the second I sat down, he reached for my hand, his eyes burning with that familiar, possessive light. We drank the wine, the alcohol loosening the last of my inhibitions, and when we left the bar, we went back to his small rental apartment near the docks, a place that smelled of old wood and the sea. The betrayal was complete, a midnight storm of passion and regret that left me lying awake in a stranger's bed at 3 a.m, staring at the peeling plaster of the ceiling, while the sound of the harbor water lapping against the boats outside sounded like a ticking clock. I stood up quietly, dressing in the dark, and walked back to the hotel, the cool night air doing nothing to clear the heavy, toxic cloud of guilt that was now my constant companion. When I opened the door to the hotel suite at 4 a.m, expecting to find the room dark and Daniel asleep, the lights were fully on, casting a harsh yellow glow over the terracotta floor. Daniel was sitting on the edge of the bed, his suitcase fully packed and closed by his feet, his passport and plane ticket sitting on the nightstand next to my phone, which I had accidentally left behind on the dresser. I froze in the doorway, the key card still clutched in my hand, my voice dying in my throat as I saw the look on his face. There was no anger there, no tears, just a cold, structural calculation that told me he had already assessed the damage and made his decision. He pointed to my phone, his voice flat and dead. "You left it unlocked on the counter. Leo texted you to ask if you made it back to the room safely after you left his apartment." I reached out my hands, taking a step toward him, the lies rising to my lips in a desperate, instinctive attempt to save myself. But he stood up, his posture straight and unyielding. "Don't," he said, the word carrying a weight that stopped me in my tracks. "Don't lie to me, Elena. I've spent 5 years building a life based on trust, and you've destroyed it in 3 days on our honeymoon. I'm taking the morning flight back to New York. You can stay here with him, or you can do whatever you want, but our marriage is over." He picked up his suitcase, his movements as neat and organized as they had always been, and walked past me toward the door, not looking at my face as I stood there, paralyzed by the sheer speed of my own ruin. I called his name, my voice cracking into a sob as I begged him to stay, to talk to me, to let me explain. But he didn't pause. He opened the door, stepped out into the quiet hallway, and pulled it shut with that same soft, final click that now sounded like the closing of a coffin. I fell to my knees on the cold tile floor, the silence of the room rushing back in to suffocate me. The scent of Leo's cologne still on my skin, a mocking reminder of what I had traded for my husband's love. I realized then, with a devastating clarity, that Leo was just a ghost, a fantasy of a past I had outgrown, and that Daniel was the real, solid life I had thrown away for a moment of cheap excitement. I sat alone in the luxury suite on our honeymoon, the sun beginning to rise over the Amalfi Cliffs, realizing that the marriage I had sought to escape had already left me, and that I was now truly alone, trapped in the wreckage of my own choices.